Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Profitable Pastures 2025. Tonight is our second of third webinars. I am Birgit Martin. I am the current chair of the Ontario Forage Council. We want to acknowledge tonight's sponsors, actually sponsors for all three of our webinars for Profitable Pastures. They are the Beef Farmers of Ontario and Royal LePage. Our sponsor for this evening's speakers is Trillium Mutual Insurance. So I'm going to, at this point, introduce our speakers, and then they will take over in a moment. So our speakers tonight are Marcus V. Talamini Jr. He is a PhD agronomist that began his professional life working with agricultural water management in France and in Brazil. Marcus then got his PhD in New Zealand, working with water and nitrogen management in resilient grass pastures. After a period of consultancy in southern Brazil, working with cover crops, dual-purpose cereals, and integrated crop livestock systems, Marcus came to Canada, where he is a postdoctoral scientist on Dr. Eric Lyons' team, working with sustainable grazing strategies for Ontario conditions. Dr. Eric Lyons is an associate professor in the Department of Plant Agriculture at the University of Guelph. His area of research is turfgrass science and physiology. Much of his work on establishment, agronomy, persistence, and new technology can be applied to pastures as well as sports fields. With that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Eric Lyons and Marcus V. Talamini Jr.
Welcome, everyone. We're happy to be here. It's the first time I've ever done a team talk on Zoom, and Marcus and I are sitting in the same room together, but on different screens, so you can actually see us so we don't appear really small. Today's talk is something Christine O'Reilly asked me to put together, and I asked Marcus to join because Marcus knows quite a bit about this stuff. This is kind of what his PhD was on, and it's about what grass wants. And when we say grass, we're not just talking about grass, we're talking about pastures. I tend to focus on what the grasses want because that's what I focused on. That's what I focus on in my research is grass species, monocots. I work as you were told, in turfgrass. I also have a wheat program, and I also have a pasture program. So between those three programs, most of the time I'm talking about monocots or grasses, but we definitely recognize that when we talk about grass in a pasture, we're talking about all the species of pasture. As Marcus said, anything that's not brown. So anything covering the ground is what we're referring to here. And today's slide set is just a number of bullet points. There's not a lot of pictures. It's just to guide our way through this to make sure that we're covering what we want to cover, and that we're talking about what we want to talk about. First of all, there are a couple pictures in it. I want to give credit to Caroline Reisiger, who's a PhD candidate in Dr. Kimberly Schneider's lab, and this is some of her plot work that she's doing, and then we have some of her grazing work later in the talk that we're going to show you. Without any further ado, I'm going to come over here, and I think we've introduced ourselves, and Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, so hello everyone. I would like just to talk a little bit about the project I'm working on here at the University of Guelph. So I'm working in a project where we are trying to identify ideal grazing strategies to keep the pastures resilient and persistent here for the region of Ontario, Southern Ontario. I would like to make it clear when it comes to the concept of persistence and resilience, okay? So persistence is how long the sowed species will last in time. I'll give you an example. In New Zealand, for example, most of the pastures they had there would last from 6 to 10 years, something like that. It is important to keep your pasture persistent because it is a very big investment to renew your pasture, okay? And resilience is the ability a pasture has to come to its original stage, either to come back to a mix, more or less the proportion it was sowed, or to a monoculture as it was sowed at first, right? So I'm gonna talk a lot about those two concepts, and I would like to make an observation about sunlight, light, solar radiation. All those terms I'm gonna use here, they mean the same thing. Energy coming from the sun, right? Okay, next one, if you please. Right, we're gonna talk here tonight, so we've done already the introduction. We're gonna talk about plant nutrition, light interception, height management, how they relate each other. We're not gonna actually teach you how to manage things, but make you understand how nutrition and interception are linked to the height management.
Right, and the key here is to get you thinking the way the plant is experiencing its environment. So there's this long history of evolution that has programmed these plants, for lack of a better term, to act in a certain way when exposed to certain external stimuli. And what Marcus is going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about today is this is what the plant is going to do when it experiences these environments. And once you start thinking about plants in that way, we hope that it helps you make better decisions about what you need to do for your pastures. That's the concept behind this idea of thinking about what the plant wants, as opposed to what my cattle need. And then you have to make the decision balancing those. So Mark, I'll just hand it back to Marcus.
Right, so at first I'm gonna talk about plant nutrition. Are all resources equally important in plant nutrition? From a nutrition in plant perspective, yes. So all nutrients in their respective amounts and playing their respective holes inside the plant, they are important, right? So if there is any deficiency in any of them, yields can be compromised. But then why are water and nitrogen so special, so much studied in agriculture? Because from a management point of view, water and nitrogen are the two most lacking resources worldwide. Okay, so it is important to provide the plants with water and nitrogen because nitrogen is highly demanded by plants. So let's say for grasses, a level of around 3% is okay, a little bit more is high, it increases like the protein levels, etc. But generally, like worldwide speaking, it is very frequently found that also all the soils in a certain region, they are gonna not be able to provide enough nitrogen for the plants, okay? I'm gonna give you guys examples of roles played by phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and magnesium. Phosphorus is very important for like the energy, everything linked to energy inside the plants has probably phosphorus involved in it. Potassium is linked to a very important thing, which is the osmotic regulation and the stomata opening or closing. So it affects a lot the photosynthesis and the transpiration, to water loss by plants. Sulfur is linked to proteins. It composes like a huge amount of amino acids that will compose the proteins, and that's why it is important. And magnesium, just one super important role, it is the central atom in the chlorophyll molecule. Okay, so now please advance.
Well, I'm just going to add something here and talk about a little bit about two things that we do when we teach. And the first thing is, if I want to show students plants responding to an external stimuli, the two easiest things for me to work with are nitrogen and water. I can show changes in root depth and root proliferation by restricting where the water flows in a soil. I can changes in carbon allocation between shoots and roots by changing the amount of nitrogen in the soil. So there's a lot of things that I can get plants to respond to using nitrogen and water. And so they are two of the strongest responses that we have. So we're going to use those as an example a lot tonight. The other thing is, I always say this is the numbers on a bag of fertilizer. So simple, so straightforward. They're, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And if you actually look at the relative content of those nutrients in a plant, and even in the seed, but let's talk about plants, because we work in pastures. We don't want seed. We're not growing seed. Why is phosphorus the second number there? There's a lot more potassium in the plant than there is phosphorus. In fact, there's more sulfur and calcium in the plant than there is phosphorus. So why does phosphorus get such a high standing there? And that is because those numbers on the bag are in the order that they're of their importance to need to be added to increase yield. So nitrogen is going to increase yield the most. It's the most likely to be limiting in your field. After that, phosphorus is the next likely to be limiting in their field, particularly if you're growing grain. We're not growing grain. And then after that, potassium will be limiting. But potassium will only be limiting if there's more nitrogen and phosphorus there. It rarely becomes limiting unless you've added nitrogen and phosphorus. So it's always important to understand why those numbers, if you're ever wondering which nutrient, it's the numbers in the bag. And it's not based on how much is in the plant. It's based on how likely you are to have to need to add it to increase your yields.
And we have set some slides specifically for nitrogen and water due to their importance, okay? So in the plants, 50% of all the nitrogen they have, it is linked to the photosynthetic apparatus, okay? So linked to the metabolism of like receiving the light, intercepting it, breaking the water molecule, and then proceeding like to the synthesis of sugars, right? The rest plays many other roles. So proteins, structural compounds, DNA, etc., right? Now, as you all guys know, when you add nitrogen, you have like a canopy expansion, okay? RUE stands for radiation use efficiency, and I'm gonna talk about quality. So nitrogen, when added, it will allow a canopy expansion, which is super important for intercepting more sunlight. Okay, so the leaves, the produced leaves are going to be wider and longer, and this is important for intercepting more light. When you add more nitrogen as well, the chlorophyll levels inside the plant, they are raised, so you have a higher radiation use efficiency. What is radiation use efficiency? It is the amount of solar energy you must grab to produce a certain amount of plant biomass, okay? Generally, it is measured by grams of dry matter, produced per megajoule of energy intercepted, right? The values are generally very low, depending on the plant, 2, 3.5, that varies a lot. And it's very low. So solar panels, they are more efficient in using sunlight than plants. But that's a natural thing. That's how evolution happened, right?
Yeah. And the key here is if you don't have a leaf there and the light's hitting the ground, you're not intercepting it, you're not converting that light energy into metabolizable energy for your cattle, for your sheep, for your grazing animals. And so what I always teach is nitrogen drives growth and recovery. It drives that initial growth, it drives that size, those leaves, and also the more nitrogen that's in them, the higher quality that feed is. And then post grazing, nitrogen's what's going to allow the regrowth, that recovery. And generally, we'll talk more about, like, we're talking a lot about nitrogen here. We're talking about how nitrogen works in the environment, and there's lots of ways to increase nitrogen in the environment. And Marcus will be talking about that.
Yeah, no, you can come back, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So about quality, nitrogen is very important for plant quality as well. Plants that are deficient in nitrogen, they will have like a lot more fiber than other, compared like to other important components. And crude protein is linked directly to the amount of nitrogen a plant has. So there's a magic number, 6.25. If you make that times the percentage of nitrogen a plant has, then you get the amount of crude protein a plant has, right? So I said before 3%, so that would result in a crude protein level in a grass of 18.75%, okay? Last thing I want to talk here is how yield is built, okay? And this is important because imagine, then you have a certain amount of sunlight that is incident on the canopy. The canopy, like, is not intercepting everything, it's just a fraction, okay? So you have that fraction, and then from that fraction, you have how well that energy is used to produce like sugars that will build the plant structure and then the yield. So this is the idea, okay, of how yield is built. Incident sunlight times the fraction of the interception here, times how well it used, that is represented by the radiation use efficiency, okay? Then in the end, you get your yield. There are like the mineral components, but they are like absorbed as the plant grows in a certain like proportion. So basically most of the things in the plant, the yield then is generated by carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and the other components, they are minor when it comes like to percentage in dry matter, right? We can proceed. So water, represented by W. So water, it is super important to photosynthesis. Why? Because water is broken in the photosynthesis, right? It is the first part of the photosynthesis. It is actually the part that requires energy to be done. Just as curiosity, there is a part of the photosynthesis that is done exclusively when there is light, and a part that happens when there is light, and it happens in the dark as well, okay? Which is the sugar synthesis. So water is the universal solvent. It takes part in many biochemical reactions inside the plants. Now pay attention, it keeps the canopy expanded, right? So when the plant is water deficient, the cells, they are not like turgid, they're gonna like be smaller in size, and then the plants will have that sad aspect, the leaves will be down. When they are watered back again, they will tend like to keep their leaves up and intercepting more light, which is important for the yield. Water also regulates canopy temperature. When underwater deficits, the plants cannot regulate the temperature well, and actually that will make them go mature quicker, so they will age quicker, okay? They will complete their life cycle quicker. So it is important to regulate the temperature to prevent that, and also to allow photosynthesis to happen at its maximum efficiency, which is around 26 degrees Celsius.
So one of the things we both acknowledge is most of you don't control water. But you do control your cattle when your plants are experiencing high water efficiency or high water use or high water availability, excuse me, and low water availability. And understanding that when leaves are formed in most of our grasses, they will actually change their size and shape if they are formed under a time of drought stress. So understanding that if you have a period of drought stress and you're still getting some growth, when those plants move forward post that drought stress time, they will continue to have a change structure, and you might get a little less performance out of that pasture even after water returns, because the leaves that were formed during that drought period will be a different size and different shape than they would be if there was full water availability. So understanding that the plant is responding to its environment and that it's changing the way it's growing, that might impact what you see 3 weeks later post-drought, is important.
Right, so well-fed pastures, they respond. Managing all the resources well will directly impact your yield, your persistence, and resilience. Why is your persistence and resilience affected by that? Because, I mean, there is a problem here. I will make the problem, I'll mention one word that summarizes all the problem: weed. Okay, if you do not control the weed, they will take over your pasture. And weed is the major problem in persistence and resilience, right? So when your pasture, it closes the canopy and it does not allow weed to take light, okay, then it is persistence, because you are not allowing other plants to grow. It's only your pasture. And then it affects resilience as well. So when the pasture is recovering after being grazed, that is resilience. That is when it's coming back to its original form after having provided feed for the cattle. And then weed, when it is suppressed, like they won't keep regrowing. Your pasture is prevailing. nitrogen plays an essential role on that, and then keeping high yields. Here I have a real example from grasses in New Zealand. What are those numbers, Marcus? So kilograms of dry matter per hectare per heat unit. So heat unit is a measure created by agronomists to measure like plant growth, accumulated dry matter, okay? And grasses have a base temperature of 3 degrees Celsius. So imagine if the daily temperature was 13 degrees Celsius, then the plants accumulated 10 heat units in that day, and 10 times the values being showed in that table represent the amount of kilograms of dry matter per hectare accumulated in one day. So in the scenario where the plus N, which is well-fed in nitrogen, and plus W, well-fed in water, the plants will accumulate up to 14.4 kilograms of dry matter per day per hectare. And the example I gave in 13 degrees Celsius would be 144 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day, which is amazing. It seems like surreal, too good to be true, right? So the thing is, are the values going to be always like that? Not exactly. That depends on the kind of pasture you have. That depends a lot on the environment. If you have lower temperatures, they will accumulate less, okay? But the idea here is just to show, look, if your plants are well fed on water but not well fed on nitrogen, the values can go down to 2.1. If your plants are well fed on nitrogen but not in water, it can go down to 8. And if they are neither well fed in nitrogen nor in water, it can go down to 1.4. That varies according to the type of soil as well, to the water retention, to how much nitrogen your soil can naturally provide, okay? But that's the main idea. In the next slide, there is something that I want to show you. Look, when well fed in water and nitrogen, the plants can produce up to 10 times more, okay? But this example is for grasses, okay? And for the grasses that were studied, which were, how do they call here in Canada? Orchard grass? Oxford?
Orchard grass.
Orchard grass, tall fescue, perennial ryegrass, and Bromus valdivianus. So those are the grasses used for this study being displayed here.
And the key here to remember is you know what I always like to say is this number here. If we don't have control of water, which we don't, but we might have control of nitrogen, and we're going to acknowledge later that you don't have to add nitrogen as fertilizer. There's other ways to make sure that there's nitrogen in your pastures, such as legumes and other things that are coming. But the key here is nitrogen, even in the absence of water, can show a very big increase in your potential yields, and that means your potential feed availability for your cattle. But it also causes some issues in that if you're producing this much feed, how are you dealing with it? And I think Marcus is going to talk about some strategies on that in a second here.
Right. So nitrogen always from fertilizers. Well, just reminding you at first that it can be absorbed by plants from the soil in the shape of ammonium, nitrate and nitrite, okay? A reminder that when the plants absorb like nitrogen from a fertilizer, you have to allow them to grow a little bit before allowing the animals to enter the pasture and graze it, because they need to metabolize all that nitrate into other compounds, or else they may become toxic to the animals, right? So you always have to allow some days for them to regrow, etc. So nitrogen, it does not necessarily have to come from fertilizers. So you can use legumes and pasture mixes, you can use manure, and you have to keep your soil healthy. Then it can provide, it can allow the plants to have a decent growth. They will like mineralize nitrogen and allow the plants to take nitrogen coming directly from the soil, okay? That's your strategy of management here. It is up to you to choose. If you have easy access to manure, if fertilizer like is being costly or not, if you can use like legumes in a pasture mix, okay? So that varies according to your kind of management. Okay, light interception. I remember that when I was in New Zealand, some researchers there, they were always, we were discussing how important nitrogen was in allowing yield to be created, to be built. But then some researchers were like, yeah, but you know, all the mineral nutrients and water, they just serve for the plants to intercept more light, and that's the most important resource, okay? So that's how important, like in their view and their way of doing science it was. And yes, they convinced me, okay? So it is super important, like to intercept light. Actually, question here, which is more important, to intercept more light or to use the light well? So as I have already answered this question by when I started talking. So it is a lot more important to intercept light than to use it well, because plants use energy in a like their efficiency is very bad. There are more than 70 years of studies showing that intercepting more light is more important for yield generation than using the light well. Okay, but anyway, if they don't use the light, if there's no photosynthesis, there's no plant growth, right? So photosynthesis is the main plant growth energy, engine, right? And now I'm going to talk about the leaf area index. What is the leaf area index? So the leaf area index is a concept that like the idea of this is the amount of leaf area you have per square meter of bare soil, right? Generally, okay, for pastures, a leaf area index, when it reaches the value of 4, it means like that 95% of the light is being intercepted. It can, again, it can vary, okay, according to the plant structure, to the species, right? But for the pastures that are used here, like in this region, pastures that are not tropical, so a value of 4 means like an interceptance of 95%. This is linked to the height, okay? So you allow the plants like to grow and they will go higher and higher until they reach a certain limit, right? Which is 95%. Then after that, shadow starts to be cast on lower leaves and they go like to senescence, they will die, they will remobilize nitrogen to other parts of the plant. Nitrogen is mobile inside the plant, so it goes like the plant reuses it from like older leaves to newer leaves. And this is one of the reasons why senescent material like it loses quality. Nitrogen like is being relocated to more important parts the plants are using right now, and that leaf like it's left with a lot of fiber but super low levels of protein.
So one other concept I want to talk about with leaf area index, and you know, this idea of leaf area index is a scientific term that is maybe a little abstract, but in the end, it's the density of your pasture. If you stand over it and you look down, are you seeing leaves everywhere? Are you seeing ground and leaves? Are you seeing understory weeds and leaves? And one other thing that happens is as you grow height, you close the canopy. As you completely close the canopy, now something happens. The base of those plants actually see the quality of light that's coming through. So shade is not low light. Shade is actually filtered light. Shade from a plant. So when plants sense that they're in shade as opposed to in full sun, so if there's a hole in the canopy, they're coming out, they actually change the way they grow. So most of our grasses and a lot of our legumes, we rely on tillering or expansion or horizontal growth to fill in those areas. So if you let the pasture continue to grow tall past the closed canopy, you tend to get a larger flux in far red light versus red light. So far red light passes through the leaves, red light is absorbed by the leaves for photosynthesis. And then one of the best examples of this is what happens is plants grow towards the light when they're in the shade, right? And what grasses do is if they're shaded, they don't produce new tillers. They take all the energy that they would put into producing new tillers and getting that density across to intercept the light this way. They put it all into growing taller. And as they're growing taller, they're extending their leaves farther. They're diluting their nitrogen. Sorry, I don't know how to turn this off of my Zoom, but they're diluting their They're diluting their nitrogen in those leaves, therefore decreasing the feed quality, and they're not tillering out. So then when a grazing event does occur, you actually have more bare spots. And if you take it down as low as you want, you might have more weed interception, because now those weed seeds will see red light as opposed to far red light, and they'll think it's time to germinate. So remember that as the canopy gets higher, it closes. Once it's closed, that's when we want to graze it. We don't want to let it keep going taller, because then we change the way the plant grows, and then it responds to that. It thins itself out, and then when the red light does come, those weed seeds see it and they germinate. And so that's a great interaction of how light and leaf area index, as Marcus put it, impacts persistence of our pastures.
Yes. Just one last comment here now that Eric was talking about it. After the plants, they reach like a certain, like a big level of light interception, okay? If you allow them to keep growing like more and more, they will immediately go reproductive, right? And you don't want that to happen, because then pasture quality will like be destroyed, like it will go super low. It can happen, like, and not everything is lost, okay? That you can still like harvest for hay, for example. But I'm gonna talk like more about it later. Okay. Right. So as the pasture height, it is correlated to the light and light interception, right? Right. So here for the pastures used here, like in Canada, what is the height that corresponds to 95% of interception, which is like the grazing point, you know, when you allow the cattle to go in? Generally from 20 to 30 centimeters, depending on the kind of pasture you're using, right? The ideal cattle entrance and height. So the entrance, when the light interception is 95%, and the exit when the light interception is from 30 to 50, depending on your kind of management, which corresponds to a height of 5 to 10 centimeters, right? Eric was talking then about the shading, and now about the quality. Again, if you allow the plants to go reproductive, your pasture quality will be a lot lower. If your bottom leaves reach senescence, their quality will go a lot lower, right? Now, just as a curiosity, I'm going to talk a little bit about tropical pastures. Those plants, they have like different patterns.
Should I?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
no, it's not the next slide.
Yeah. So the tropical pastures, those plants, they tend to have like a lot higher biomass. They build a lot more structure, okay? Nonetheless, as the plants, like they have to sustain that whole big structure, their quality tends to be lower because the amount of fiber is higher to sustain that whole structure, right? So this is one thing that is different. Generally, those pastures will tend to close canopy very quickly if provided enough nitrogen, okay? But their quality like will always be lower. Though like the amount of biomass produced is a lot higher. And yeah, we can't forget that in tropical environments, generally there is no snow, and then they will keep producing like dry matter the whole year long. Right. So here, what intercepts light? The leaves. And then there is like the problem. What do the cows want to eat? The leaves, because they're the most nutritious part of the plant. They are the most interesting material, plant material for the cattle to eat. Of course, the cows, they're going to eat stems, they're going to eat flower, they're going to eat everything. But what is most interesting from a nutritious point of view are the leaves. Due to like the amount of fibers, the stem has a lot more, okay? And then the leaves, they are more easily digested, okay? So we were talking about the height management, and then the upper pasture parts, it should not be upper pasture, sorry, the upper pasture parts, they shade the bottom parts, and that's when the plants realize, we were talking about that, the filtered light, and I mean, even the amount of light, the amount of energy that is received by the bottom parts, they get a lot lower, and that's when the plant perceives, and that happened due to evolutionary stuff, the plant perceives that their bottom parts are no longer being very well used, so they will start to invest more to intercept direct light, keep growing like at the top, okay? And then the light interception at the entrance and exit, keep that in mind, 95% at the entrance, and generally 30 to 50% when the cattle leaves that paddock and go to another one. Right, so here's a picture from southern Brazil, okay? We have lots of grasses here, but we have a problem with weed in this region, okay? So you can see lots and lots of seed heads, and I mean, that's when the pasture like loses its quality, right? Then we have also the problem that the cattle will eat the weed, and the weed are not as nutritious as your sowed pastures, okay? But when like it reaches like this stage, you can know like your fiber levels are a lot higher, and your protein, your crude protein levels, they're gonna be a lot lower. Yes, so again, a note on weed on how important it is like to control them. If they are not controlled, they will take your field over. They are less nutritious than the sowed species. They can be poisonous to your animals. They can host diseases and shout the insects that are ravagers to your pasture, okay? So do not allow them to intercept the solar radiation. Allow your pasture to do that. This picture being showed here, it is in my PhD thesis, okay? What is it about? So we have a perennial ryegrass field here, and then Bromus valdivianus, which is other pasture species I studied and other grass, but it's taking over this field, right? So everywhere where there is like a red circle, it is a Bromus plant, and the rest is perennial ryegrass. If not controlled, like it will take over one day or the other. So the main key points we wanted to talk about, and just to let you know, so all nutrients matter, yes, but some matter more than the others. Because of management reasons, then I hope we have showed you that, yeah, nitrogen like is going to be super important. Providing everything is important, yes, but keep in mind like why nitrogen is super important and how yield is generated. As nitrogen influences a lot canopy expansion, then you want it to happen to intercept more sunlight for the reasons how yield is built. Well-managed pastures equals healthy pastures, which is a synonym of productive pastures, and the same thing as resilient and persistent pasture. They will last longer in time, they will have their ability to come back after grazing, okay? When it comes to the light interception at the cattle entrance and exit, there is one thing I would like to talk about here, which is the overgrazing, okay? So when like the residual height is very low, your pasture is not intercepting a lot of light. If the residual is very low, the plants will naturally like abort lots of root, okay? Because you must have aerial structure, so above ground structure to sustain your underground structure, and same thing, you must have underground structure to sustain your aerial structure. After being grazed, the pasture will naturally, that's natural, abort root biomass, okay? But if it's grazed too much, a lot of the root biomass is going to be aborted, and the pasture is going to suffer, like consume lots of energy stored in the roots to regrow the aerial parts. Also remember that when it's very low in height, it will be intercepting less light, so less photosynthesis is happening, and less sugars are being sent to the roots, okay? That's why plants suffer. Overgrazing can result in many problems. So that's why keeping the pasture healthy and allowing a decent residual height is important. Yeah.
All right, so we just have a picture of pasture here to show some research that's going on. This is Caroline's work again, and she's actually looking at adding nitrogen to pastures in a fertilizer form, and she's actually looking at how that might impact legume persistence or legume persistence in the pasture, because in the end, we don't want to be spending money on nitrogen fertilizers or on fertilizers in general. We would prefer that the ecosystem provide that nitrogen through healthy soils, through those things, and how the integration and management of your pasture and how the integration and management of the grazing impacts those legumes is important. One thing that Marcus was talking about that spurred something in my head, and that was the idea behind light being so important. And we often look at, well, what happens when we have a warm September and October, and a warm, wet September and October? As the days are getting shorter and shorter, and oftentimes there's moisture there, there's nitrogen availability there, but there's just not enough light as those days get shorter and shorter, and production just goes down. And you can see that in other parts of the world where they don't have winters quite as severe as ours, that even though they have the heat units, but they're only getting 10 hours of sunlight a day, their productivity of their pastures is much lower than when they have 16 hours of sunlight in a day. And that difference is definitely seen when you look at production of the pasture. Now that's the amount of time they're exposed to sunlight, and also the total amount of sunlight, because the angle in the sky is a lot lower. But the same thing happens when you overgraze, is now most of the sunlight is hitting the ground. It's not hitting the leaves, and therefore your growth rate is much lower. Another thing that happens, and this is something that Marcus and I were talking about yesterday, is as you expose the ground, and let's say there is some water available, that heats up the soil temperatures, therefore increasing the amount of evaporation from the ground. So when the plant is sitting in the ground, it's regulating how much water it uses. It has stomates that it opens and closes, and there's a little trick here. I would say they preserve water in the soil, but most of our pasture grasses don't do that. Most of our pasture species, whether it be clover, tall fescue, timothy, orchard grass, they all, for the most part, waste water. Their goal is to get the water out of the soil because they know they're more likely to survive the drought than their neighbor. And so they tend to waste a lot of water, but the key here is when you have open ground, it wastes even more water, and you actually get even more things. Soil temperatures go up, therefore the plant's more likely to want to throw up a seed because it's going to mature more. So generally maintaining that canopy is very important in this process. And at this point, I think we've covered what we want to cover, and we want to open it up for questions. Marcus has another idea.
One last phrase.
We'll keep talking until someone interrupts us.
Worse than allowing sunlight to hit the bare soil is allowing sunlight to hit weed, okay, which is your enemy. You don't want it, okay? So sunlight that is not hitting your pasture is a wasted resource, right? So make sure that your plants will be intercepting sunlight.
And while remembering that if the pasture is too high, you're actually limiting the amount of sunlight intercepted after grazing or after cutting. If you get it high enough that you have to cut it, you've now thinned out that pasture, because that pasture is going to self-thin itself. Hi, Christine.
Hi. Thank you for that. Wow, I've learned so much about plants in the last half an hour or so, which is fantastic, because I don't think I'm alone on the call tonight in that I learned most of my how to grow pastures from people who raise livestock. And I think that's very common amongst our audience tonight. So thank you so much for bringing this plant perspective to us. And yeah, so we do have some questions in the chat. The first one is about sainfoin. So before we launch into that, are either of you familiar with sainfoin?
I am not. I looked up a picture of it while Marcus was talking.
Yeah.
So Marcus might be more familiar with it.
Yeah, so what is like the specific question? I have never worked with sainfoin, but I know the plant, but yeah.
Right. So the first question is, what is sainfoin?
A legume right? It is high quality. It can provide decent feed for the cattle, and when it comes like to the bloating risk, it has some like tannins that prevent it from happening, right? The
Yes.
cattle generally likes to eat it, meaning that it has high palatability, right? And yeah, it is a legume and it fixes nitrogen, so it can go like very well into a pasture mix. Just a note, I would like to talk about pasture mixes. When you have it, it is very normal that you did sow something, and after some time, the proportion of things begin to change. Some species we start to see less, some species we start to see more. That is natural, that is like ecology. So some species, they are going to be shaded by the others, and their proportion is going to diminish as time goes by. This is a natural thing. So mixes, they, 1 year after the other, the mixes you did sow is never going to be the same. Generally, after like 4 or 5 years, only 3 species that will be present, 1 dominant and 2 in a lower amount. This is not a rule, but generally that's what happens.
So there is a follow-up question on Samfoin, and if you don't know, I have thoughts. So the follow-up is, how effective is Samfoin in pasture for beef cattle? Is it a staple legume, or does it do better in certain geographical areas?
Yeah, like all the species, it varies a lot. It varies a lot according to the environmental conditions, okay? Generally, sainfoin can present some resistance to drought, for example, to dry environments, okay? But keep in mind that even like when these events happen, like we've talked a lot about water here, like the quality and the amount of biomass produced, it's going to be affected a lot. It can go well, but I would say like talk to someone that is working in the region where you are, because that can vary a lot. Yeah.
Hi.
Christine.
So this is where I will weigh in. Samfoin is getting a lot of attention in Western Canada. There are some breeders working on it. At this time, I'm not aware of any varieties that are both winter hardy, like they need in the prairies, and moisture tolerant, like the varieties coming out of places like the British Isles. So Samfoin doesn't tend to persist well in Ontario because we don't have varieties that can handle both cold and wet. They tend to only do one or the other. So, very cool, lots of potential, but as far as I know, I'm not aware of any being grown on a large scale here. But Eric.
I threw a picture of it on the shared screen. It's an AAFC picture, so I figured I can share it. So that's what it looks like, and you can tell from the flower structure that it's actually a legume. I mean, from the leaf structure that it's actually a legume, and the flower structure. So it's a leguminous plant, and as you say, one of the biggest problems with Ontario is cold with moisture. So we have generally moist growing conditions, where precipitation exceeds ET each year. But we also have extreme cold, but we also have extreme cold in the presence of moisture, which is what's really unique. And one of my research areas is winter survival. And overcoming winter survival issues in pasture species is very difficult because the nature of a pasture is not very level. So there's pockets of ice formation below the canopy that you never see that kill plants, and there are issues. One of the things that Marcus said when he moved here was, and his colleagues in Brazil were asking him, what's it like in Canada? What are pastures like in Canada? And his phrase to me was, snow changes everything. It's very different here from where he's worked in the past, because even in southern Brazil, where they're at the same latitude we are, but to the south, so they're still growing cool season pasture species. And in New Zealand, where they're growing cool season pasture seeds, they don't have snow. They don't have those extreme temperatures. So that definitely changes things on what we can grow and how well we can grow it. So I think.
Yeah, so there's some follow-up questions just about, okay, Samfoin may not be a great fit for us here in Ontario, but what legumes might be a good fit for pastures?
Here in the region, well, the clovers generally, like they would perform well, as we can see like in experiments at the research station. So white clover, the red clover. I was thinking here, I would like to know more also about the Vicia plants. Okay, check.
It's not a
Vicia-
monocrop,
vetches.
sorry.
In
Vetches?
English,
I think
Vicia?
Vicia is the Latin for vetches, is it not?
Yes, vetch. That's the
Vetch. Yeah. Okay.
vetch. I would like to know more about that. But one thing that we have observed a lot in the experiment is that when in a mix, birds fruit trefoil, lotus, so after some years, like it will disappear. It will disappear. It is not persistent, right? Because it's like smaller and the other plants, they're gonna shade it a lot.
Yeah, that's just it, is if you're gonna manage birds fruit trefoil as a legume in a pasture in Ontario, you really have to watch your height management. Because it's not a big plant, it doesn't wanna grow tall. And so if you're letting your grasses get really tall, they will shade it out. Grasses don't want legumes around. You know, evolutionarily, legumes take spaces from grasses. And then also when it is shorter, the cattle wanna eat the legume first because it's the tastier one. Unless there's a problem with some of the other chemicals that are in some of our legumes. But the key here is we're having trouble with our birds foot trefoil because of its height. And so height management in our pastures, in our experiment, we're on a strict rotational thing that we're moving through the pastures. We're not changing stocking density on those paddocks. So we got behind a few years, and that's when the birds foot trefoil just disappeared.
You can try lucerne as well, but with lucerne, like
Alfalfa.
alfalfa. Sorry, lucerne is how it is called in New Zealand. The thing about this plant is it is after 2 or 3 years, it starts to have some incompatibility problems. It's not compatible with itself anymore. So that can affect then your pasture persistence, okay? And I remember one thing from New Zealand that my supervisor there, my PhD supervisor, he would always talk to farmers and make this. So this is the entrance height for lucerne, 30 centimeters always, okay, invariable. That's what you do.
And that's, I don't know how realistic that is in Ontario.
Yeah.
One other experiment that we do have going that I wanna plug, because we're going through a lot of data. Marcus spent a lot of hours just looking at thousands of lines of data. Thousands upon thousands of lines of data. Is we have a project up in New Liskeard where we looked at existing pastures and how we're going to, I'm not gonna say renew them, rejuvenate, but we looked at different methods of incorporating legumes into those pastures and then have measured the persistence, well, actually, whether or not they even came in, and then the persistence of them over the last 4 years, and we're hoping to do it this summer for a 5th year. A little bit funding dependent, but we think we've scraped it together. We're gonna see how that goes. But we're looking at that and we don't have the data yet. It's a lot of data and there's a lot of, anytime you're that far away from home, you gotta make sure the data is what you think it is. And so we're working on that and hopefully we'll have something to report on that to the grazing community soon. Of course, that's in a northern environment, but it will still apply.
When it comes like to talk about the persistence and resilience, it requires some more years of studies as well, because the dynamics of the species, they change according to the year. Every year is different from the other when it comes to the weather, and that affects plant growth a lot. So it requires many years of the same management to see how things happen, and then we can finally take some conclusions. So I think that after this season we can have enough data and discussions to provide decent information on the persistence and resilience.
That's something really exciting to look forward to. All right, we have questions piling up in the chat, so speed round for you guys. Let's try to get through some of these. Recommendations to get rid of weeds like foxtails and thistles in an established pasture.
Thistles, they can be a problem here in Canada, right?
Very much so.
Yeah, so, well, first thing is that if you do not allow them like to set, if you can clean everything to when you're setting your pasture, that is the best strategy, okay? But they always come in, they always find a way. There were some studies that were conducted in Brazil like some years ago, and they did show that 20% of weed, they would come from outside a crop field. So you will always have like seeds spreading, etc. So first, like not allowing them to prevent. And the second thing is just managing your canopy. It should be like enough for allowing weed not to take over, right? There is a problem with all the weed. They are generally like more adapted to the region where your pasture is growing than your pasture, okay? Because evolutionary things, they have many selective factors acting on them, so they are super well adapted, which is why like managing your pastures well when it comes to the canopy and to the light interception, that is a big thing, a big deal when managing weed. So providing like water and nitrogen at the right time and the right amount. So when it comes to nitrogen management, don't provide like a lot all at once, provide just, you know, like a little bit. Slow release can be another option. But we would talk to farmers, some farmers even would do like apply nitrogen after every grazing cycle. Just a little bit after every grazing cycle, that would be something, okay?
I'm smiling because I don't see that happening in Ontario.
I don't
But
That's not common practice here, no, and actually that's a great segue into the next question, which is what are your thoughts on
one other thing I wanted to ask the group, Christine.
Yeah.
Which is, honestly, one of the things I always miss out on, especially with online meetings, I don't get the questions, I don't get to listen, like how interested are people in chemical management of weeds in pasture? Right now, there's very
Stick your
little
thoughts in the chat.
What is it in the chat?
Do you use herbicides?
Yeah,
Stick
do you
answers in
use
the chat.
herbicides? And are you willing to use herbicides if there is information on better herbicides to use? Like there are great methods for grazing and then following it up with special applications of herbicides when you've overgrazed the pasture to get rid of your weeds. There's research we can do in our environment on that. But the question is it something that people are interested in knowing and will use if we do the research? Because research takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, and we have limited resources. We have limited people and we have limited money to do it. So we want to make sure we're doing research that if it is fruitful, if we find a solution, it is something farmers or practitioners will actually adopt. And so that's where I am on the weed. I would love to do weed trials in pastures, but I just don't know what the uptake will be, because there's a significant expense to it too.
So I encourage everyone, stick your thoughts in the chat. Are you willing to use herbicides? Are you interested in using herbicides? Let us know so that Eric can plan future projects. In the meantime, while they're answering that question, and this was kind of the segue from Marcus's last answer about applying a little bit of nitrogen after every grazing event. What are your thoughts about applying fertilizer after a first grazing rotation or first cut of hay in mid to late June?
Mid to late June is still like hot here. Yes.
Well, it's warming up.
Yeah.
And that.
Yeah, it makes sense if you provide a little bit. You don't have to provide a lot, but when you provide a little bit, and then as we said, like allow the plants like to grow, etc., give them time to absorb it and metabolize everything. Do not apply a lot, because remember I said that roots are aborted, right? And when the roots are aborted, they will not take nitrogen in from the soil. Okay, so just what is around the living roots. It is worthless to apply a huge amount because it's not going to be absorbed.
Yeah.
So little by little, yeah.
Timing wise, after the first hay, that's where your first recovery period is. You're hitting an time that, you know, generally we get that spring flush. So you want to apply towards the end of that spring flush. And then also, he keeps saying little amounts. Caroline's research is purposely using slow release fertilizers that release based on temperatures. So Dr. Schneider, Kimberly Schneider and Caroline devised this project, which I am I'm super excited about because it's plant competition and how nitrogen affects it. And I work with Caroline on our committee that will answer some of these questions about when to apply. Well, not really when to apply, but how much to apply. But just so you know, our strategy is a spring application of a temperature-based slow release. So when that fertilizer starts to release most rapidly, when it's still little amounts, but when it starts to is that same exact timing that you just said. So we'll have some answers on that timing maybe in a year or two. Caroline might be online right now.
Caroline is in the chat and did mention that she is working on that.
There she is.
So
Oh, there she is.
There she
Amazing.
is, yeah. And I could go into detail. I do know her project well, and she's been working hard on it.
all right. So to answer your question, Eric, we've got a mixed bag of responses. Some people prefer not to use herbicides at all, and are not interested in doing that. But there are also others that have either specific weed challenges. So creeping bedstraw is one that is a challenge to get rid of. There are others that are more just generally interested in having better information so that if they come against a particularly challenging weed, they know what tools are available to them. So it is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of.
And one other thing I do research extensively is alternative herbicides, things that are considered either organic or exempt from regulation. So like in Ontario, we have an urban pesticide ban. They call it cosmetic. It's not cosmetic. I refuse to call it that. But I test a lot of those products, and a lot of those products might work in pastures too. It's for selective control of certain, I know they work really, some of the ones I test work really well on thistle. The problem is they'll take out your clover before they'll take out your thistle. And so you'd have to come up with an innovative way to apply them. And these are fairly non-toxic, well, the government said they are essentially non-toxic chemicals.
And that is the common challenge that we have. And that's part of why herbicide use in pasture tends to be lower, is because it's a mixed stand. We want to keep legumes and grasses.
Yeah.
All right.
But there are some, go ahead.
We're already 4 minutes over time. So very, very quickly, do either of you have experience with creeping root alfalfa in a pasture?
Creeping root alfalfa?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
I assume it's an alfalfa that's been bred.
Yes, certain varieties of alfalfa have a lower set crown and they branch. They're rhizomatous essentially, so they
Okay.
will spread. And unfortunately, Earl, I don't have a ton of experience with those either. But reach out if you want to talk to me further. We can do some digging on that. Sheep pastures. We talked about entry heights for cattle. Is it different for sheep?
No, you can use the same. You know, the
Okay.
same.
When the
Yeah,
canopy
and-
closes, put the livestock in.
Yeah, because remember that the height, like it's not only linked to light interception, but also like it links to the quality as well. So you want your animals like to raise high quality stuff. So yeah.
You know, honestly, if you have the ability, and the key that we always fall back on, if you have the ability to manage your canopies between, I'm gonna up it more than he is, 40 centimeters and 10 centimeters. If you have that ability to do that, that's ideal. Never letting them get much higher than 40, 30 is best. So a foot to 16 inches. If you could enter every time at that, that's ideal. Now, I don't find that realistic for most of our people managing pastures. But that's what the goal is. And that's what the
Target.
plants want.
There's also like the fact that, you know, sheep, smaller animals, and that depends, of course, on the amount of sheep you want in a paddock, etc. But you can allow them to enter with lower heights to consume a certain amount of biomass and then move them like to the next paddock. So you can use this kind of management as well if needed. Yes, just take care when it comes to the exit height. But yeah, you can allow them like under lower entrance heights.
And just something Marcus said to me the other day, we're talking about fertilization, we're talking about heights. One of the best times to fertilize is right when the cattle are leaving, because then that's when the plant needs it for recovery, for that resilience. And it also, you get away from any super high nitrogen levels in the leaves if you're using straight urea. Not a problem if you're using slow release.
Okay, well, thank you both so much. I'm going to turn things back over to Birgit, and she's going to wrap up our evening.
All right. Thank you, Christine. And thank you, Eric. Thank you, Marcus. I'd like to also, again, thank our sponsors, Beef Farmers of Ontario and Royal LePage, for sponsoring Profitable Pastures generally. And specifically for our speakers this evening, our sponsor was Trillium Mutual Insurance. Thank you again all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you here again tomorrow night at 7:30 for our last Profitable Pastures webinar.